We're going to begin by sewing the lace upper panels to the front. This is probably the trickiest bit because you have to match them perfectly at the center. So there's a small dot on the pattern, which is where you will want the side panels to end. So here you can see a small dot, and that's where you want your seam line to end. So be sure you're checking at the seam line and not at the cut edge. And then you'll add the other side. It's easiest to sew this in one seam with both panels being attached at the same time, and you'll just pivot at the small dot. I'm using thin satin pins here. They're the easiest pins to use when you're working with lace and other fine fabrics. You'll need to use a stretch stitch here when you're sewing. Using a small zigzag. You can also use a lightning stitch or a serger. If you use a serger, it's a little more difficult to pivot at the small dot. As you approach the pivot point, you'll want to slow down and check and make sure that you know where exactly you need to pivot. And you'll want to stop right on the dot. So I've sunk the needle in. Turn. This is really helpful if you have a knee lift and a needle down function on your machine. So you'll just pivot and come back down the other side. Push back the seam allowances, and yep, there's a nice point there. So there's a lot of bulk at that pivot point, and you'll want to cut away some of that. I'm just cutting the lower front piece. You could cut through the tails of the lace as well. Back seam allowances towards the lower front so that they're not visible behind the lace. And we're going to add some top stitching. I'm using the small zigzag again. You could also use a medium with zigzag. You'll need a stitch that stretches since the seam goes diagonally across them. As you can see, my lace tails are sticking up here. I really should have pressed them back better before I started top stitching. So now I have to press them back a little bit as I'm sewing. Once you reach the center, you'll need to pivot again and continue your top stitching all the way down. Now we're going to sew the center back seam of the upper back panels. You can use a straight stitch for this because the seam is vertical on the body. Stitches at the beginning and end of the seam. This is the other tricky bit for sewing. You'll want to make sure that the center back seam is at the pivot point. You can see the pivot point is a small purple circle there. Align the cut edges. Adding a few pins again with my satin pins. They're a little hard to grip because the pin heads are very, very small. They don't have a plastic ball on the end. Now we're going to begin sewing the lower back and upper back pieces. And again, we're using a stretch stitch. I'm using a small zigzag here. You can use also a lightning stitch and a serger. Although if you're using a serger, it's a little difficult to pivot at the pivot point, but it can be done. And you want to slow down as you approach the pivot point and make sure that your seam line is matching with the pivot point. And you'll want to check at the part where it will be the stitching line and not the cut edge. So you'll want to stop on the pivot point, and you'll pivot. Here's where the knee lift comes in handy. and turn your pieces and realign the cut edges for the upper back and lower back. And you can add some pins if you want to. I haven't done that here. I just like to hold the cut edges and make sure, or the bottom of the cut edges, and just make sure that everything is lying smoothly as it goes along. Once you reach the end, you'll want to do a few back stitches. And let's see how it turned out. Has a pretty good point. So now you'll want to press the seam allowance downwards, and you can see there's a little bit of an edge sticking out. We're going to cut that off later. So I'm going to continue using my small zigzag and do that for the top stitching. You can also use a medium with zigzag for the top stitching. Once again, when you reach the center where the seam is, you'll want to pivot, turn your work, and continue the top stitching. Now we can cut off those seam allowances that are sticking out. Those just get in the way when we're trying to attach the fold-over elastic, so just cut them away. It'll be fine. Now we can set the back to the side, and we're going to work on adding the gusset. We're going to begin with the front unit and the self gusset. I'm putting the lining to the side. And you'll want to match the notches, or the centered notch, on both the front and gusset pieces. And I like to add a few pins in just those two layers before I try adding in the lining piece as well. So just pin in the center and then one pin on each end. Now you can place the lining behind, and I have the right side of the lining facing up. And just realign all the pieces at the center notch and replace the pin to go through all three layers. Now I'm doing the same on both ends, just replacing the pin to go through all three layers and adding in a couple more pins just to hold everything together, making sure that all cut edges are aligned. To sew the gusset seam, you can use a straight stitch for this because there's no stretch across this part. And just go slowly to make sure that you keep all the edges aligned and remove the pins as you go. Do a few back stitches. Now let's check and make sure that it looks nice and smooth on both sides. You want to make sure that there aren't any puckers before you trim away your seam allowances. So what we're going to do now is grade the seam allowances. Instead of trimming all the layers the same amount, I'm going to trim each layer separately. I begin with the gusset lining layer and trim that pretty close to the stitching. Then on the middle layer, I'm going to trim it just slightly above where I trimmed the gusset lining layer. And this just reduces the amount of bulk, and once you press it, you won't get any hard lines where all those seam allowances are. It'll just feel better on your body. If you have applique scissors, duck-billed scissors, that would be better to use here. I'm left-handed, as you can see, and I haven't been able to find any left-handed duck-bill scissors, so I just have to use regular blade scissors. And you can give this a good press. Now we're going to do the burrito method for attaching the back to the gusset. So we'll begin by folding back and pinning just the self gusset with the back in the center. And for this part, it's easiest if you put the pins in vertically with the pin head on the outside edge. You'll see why in just a minute. At least that's how I do it. So put a pin in the middle and on the outer edges. Once that final pin is in, we're going to roll it up. So I'm rolling up the front piece and the back, and that just brings the gusset lining up, and you just pull it over. So this is called the burrito method because it looks like a rolled burrito. And the front and back pieces are rolled up inside. That's kind of the filling of the burrito. So now I just am replacing the pins to go through all 3 layers. And you can add in a few more pins just to keep everything nice and even. And I'm putting the pins in vertically with the pin heads on the outside because once I go to sew it, I'll sew it with the self side facing up and the lining part against the feed dogs. Once again, we're just going to use a straight stitch to go across this gusset seam. Take your time and take the pins out as needed. Make sure it's nice and flat on both sides with no puckers, and we're going to repeat grading the seams again. So I'm going to just trim away the gusset lining right next to the stitching line. Cut away any extra threads too. And then the next layer I will trim just above where I trimmed the gusset lining. And now trim the final layer just a little bit. And now we turn everything right side out. Now it's time to add the fold-over elastic along the leg openings. I have included cut measurements in the pattern. If you need some extra guidance, I just attach it by feel. I don't usually pre-measure. As you can see, I've left a tail sticking out past where the lace and fabric is, and that just makes it easier later on when I'm sewing the side seams. It gives me something to hold on to. And so I'd sew my fold-over elastic in 1 pass. You can sew it in 2 passes if you're new to sewing fold-over elastic and it feels too difficult to stretch and fold at the same time. And you'll just want to stretch it slightly as you're sewing. You want to stretch the elastic and not the fabric. And you'll want to sew more along this section that I'm doing now, the lower part of the bum curve. That's really, you really want the elastic to cup against the body. And once you go onto the gusset, so once you pass this seam, you don't really need to stretch the elastic in this portion. You want to check and make sure that you're sewing through both layers of the gusset. And once you pass the seam line and get back onto the front, you'll want to begin stretching the elastic slightly again. I'm using a medium width zigzag, 3.5 wide and 2 long for when I sew the fold over elastic. And once you reach the end, you can just continue sewing and leave a little bit of a tail on this end as well. Now we're going to sew the side seams. So since there's no waist elastic, I want to start at the waistline seam, beginning at the lace edges and then coming down to the leg seam, the leg elastics, because if you end with the elastics, you can make sure that the edges match perfectly. It's a little harder to match them perfectly if you begin by sewing at the elastic edge. So in this style, there's no waist elastic, so that makes it a little easier for us. So just lift your foot and make sure that your edges are just perfectly aligned as you sew off, and then do a few back stitches. Let's see how we did. Pretty good match. So now we can add a bar tack, open up the elastics so that they are lying flat and the rest of the seam is lying flat. Sink your needle down, and this is a tool called a hump jumper, which I got from Wawak. And it's really helpful when you're trying to begin sewing on a bulky edge, or if you need to go over a bulky seam. It just lifts up the presser foot. So now I'm using a wide zigzag. I think I'm using 4 wide here, and just going forward and back on that elastic, going over the center of the seam, and it just holds it flat. And now I can trim away those excess elastic tails. And here's the finished panty. You can steam the elastics if they're not laying perfectly flat for you right off the machine. And here it is on the body. I hope you've enjoyed this sewing tutorial. Thanks for watching.